You're listening to Flashpoints on Pacifica Radio. Noam Chomsky is an internationally renowned author, linguist, and political activist. While his theories in linguistics are legendary, his work as a political activist is more well known. He is the author of dozens of books on politics that include in-depth critiques of U.S. foreign policy all over the world. In this wide-ranging interview with Flashpoints, Chomsky talks about the volatile nature of America's relationship with Pakistan, as well as an assessment of the war and occupation of Iraq and the implications for a potential war against Iran. Well, thanks for joining us, Professor Chomsky. It's good to have you back on Flashpoints after such a long hiatus, and to be able to speak with you about some of the important issues of our time. Maybe we could begin with that lit fuse of Pakistan as we go to air. The BBC is reporting that Pakistan's ousted Chief Justice is still under arrest, despite claims to the contrary, and that General Musharraf has just amended the Constitution to prevent further legal challenges to his actions. Please, if you could, spend a few minutes about this country, which appears to be one of our closest allies on the so-called war on terror.
Well, General Musharraf is, of course, a dictator, and yes, a close ally. The U.S. has been pretending that he's moving on the road to democracy in accord with the official but completely unreal Bush administration vision, as it's called, of bringing democracy to the world. Anything but he, as you say, has imprisoned the Chief Justice because the Chief Justice was trying to uphold the law, which would prevent him from running again as president. He also got rid of the rest of the High Court justices who would have opposed him and installed a bunch of cronies who have now dismissed all challenges to his reelection. He has said that he would leave his post as chief of the army. I presume that's a deal he's working out with the White House, whereby he hands over the army to some other crony and effectively remains in control, but looks as though he's making moves towards democracy that'll permit Condoleezza Rice to make some statements about progress towards democracy and so on. He'll essentially run unopposed because of the constraints introduced by the state of emergency, effectively martial law, which may be relaxed here and there, but there's no indication that they'll significantly be changed. Yes, it's probably the most dangerous country in the world and has been for a long time. Has nuclear weapons, of course. It's harboring the Qadeer Khan, the greatest proliferator, who's been leaking nuclear weapons all over to Libya, Iran, others, at least information and material relating to them. We don't know what they're doing with them. But he's kept under what's called house arrest, meaning he's essentially free to do what he wants. There are extremely severe internal problems. There's the tribal areas are pretty much out of government control. There's a so-called frontier force there, which is drawn from the tribal areas and is from pretty much the same people who, the same families and friends as the people it's supposed to be eliminating, the Taliban supporters. So when we read that a couple of hundred Pakistani soldiers have been captured up in the tribal areas, that apparently means that it's the hundreds of frontier guards who were taken into custody and then released politely when the propaganda goal of the tribes and the Taliban supporters was achieved. There's no indication that anything much can be, that the Pakistani army can or would try to do anything about that. There are some pretty nutty ideas floating around Washington from people like Kagan and O'Hanlon and others, which seem to lead to be suggesting introducing a U.S. military force up there, which, even if the military force existed, which it probably doesn't, would be could blow up in all sorts of unpredictable directions. There's also insurgency in Balochistan, which is and plenty of repression elsewhere is causing all sorts of discontent. In Balochistan, the U.S. is plainly involved in some complex way in supporting Baluchi terrorists, Jundallah, who are carrying out terrorist actions inside Iran, but they're also not controlled by the government, and that's another source of serious instability. The U.S. is supplying substantial armaments not related to the insurgencies, so like advanced jet fighters, part of the confrontation with India, really. So the situation is just explosive. The talk about democracy is a joke. The U.S. tried to engineer a kind of a pact of some sort, a power-sharing pact between Musharraf and Benazir Bhutto, the woman who's the head of the leading opposition party, apart from the Islamist parties who they don't want to, of course, have any dealings with. But that fell through. She was under house arrest, too. Nawaz Sharif, the former prime minister who Musharraf threw out in a military coup, has not been permitted to return. The chaos and dangers are almost indescribable. It's a very ominous situation.
You think that General Musharraf got a lesson in democracy based on the recent visit of the U.S. Undersecretary of State? You think the U.S. was trying to restrain his dictatorship?
I think, we don't. I mean, your guess is as good as mine, but because we don't have any information. But the Undersecretary of State happens to be John Negroponte, who's one of the leading international terrorists in the world. He has a hideous record. He was the ambassador to Honduras in the 1980s. Honduras had one of the biggest CIA stations in the world, maybe the biggest, not for reasons of security, but because Honduras was the base for Reagan's terrorist war against Nicaragua, which Negroponte had to supervise. The bases were in Honduras. And in order to make sure that the Congress kept funding Honduras in ways which not only supported the government of Honduras, but also the Contra bases. In order to ensure that, Negroponte had to keep producing reports to Congress, which were total lies about the steps towards democracy in Honduras. That was at a time when Honduras was carrying out violent state terror. In particular, one battalion trained and probably run by the CIA was carrying out massacres, assassinations, and so on. The Negroponte had to lie about that, which of course he did very easily, and maintain his position as essentially proconsul of Honduras, which is what he was called, and organizing the terrorist attacks against Nicaragua and suppressing information about the state terrorism inside Honduras. It was only natural, I suppose, in an Orwellian world that this leading international terrorist should have been appointed by Bush as the counterterrorism czar, which is the position he had prior to being made Undersecretary of State. So the idea of him going to give lessons in democracy somewhere, you can only collapse on the floor in laughter. I presume, just a guess obviously, but my presumption is that he went to Pakistan to try to work out some face-saving cover story, which I suspect is what I guessed a moment ago, that Musharraf will, as he said he will do, give up his official post as chief of the army, handing it over to some subordinate he can trust, then maybe soften the martial law arrangements slightly, enough so that Western commentators, journalists and others, political leaders can say, well, look, there's steps towards democracy, but meanwhile making sure that it's all under tight control of the dictatorship, which the U.S. will continue to arm and support. If they had another general they could think of who would take over and be a more effective client, they'd probably install him, but it looks as if they can't find anyone.
You're listening to Flashpoints on Pacifica Radio. My name is Dennis Bernstein. We're speaking with Professor Noam Chomsky. Professor Chomsky, let's turn our attention to Iraq. How would you assess the war effort at this point? Is the occupation in Iraq really a disaster for the U.S. establishment?
Well, the occupation has been a huge disaster for the United States. It's not, in fact, a very surprising one. My own guess, to tell you the truth, was, and I said it at the time, was that when the U.S. invaded, it would probably be the easiest military occupation in history. The country was held together with Scotch tape, barely. The U.S. invasion was getting rid of two brutal regimes. We're only allowed to talk about one, but there were actually two. One was Saddam Hussein. The other was the sanctions regime, which had devastated the society. It's enough to refer to the two directors of the Oil for Food program, which was supposed to be a humanitarian effort, allowing Iraq to use some of its resources for its own population. Both directors, Dennis Halliday and Hans von Sponeck, were distinguished international diplomats with a fine record. Both of them resigned in protest successively, charging that the sanctions were, in their words, genocidal. And they're the people who knew more about Iraq than any Westerner. The U.S. refused to allow them to testify to the UN Security Council, which was theoretically supervising it, because of what they would reveal about U.S.-UK intervention to turn the sanctions into the genocidal acts that they vividly describe. Von Sponeck has an important book about the topic. It's called A Different Kind of War. Appeared a year ago. It's unmentionable in the United States. I don't think there's been a word about it except at the fringes. I mean, I've written about it and others. So that regime should theoretically have been ended. In fact, it was ended with the occupation. Saddam Hussein was gone. The U.S. has, of course, enormous resources. It looked as if they should have certainly been able to impose something like, say, Vichy France without any problem at all. And amazingly, they failed. The intervention, the aggression was so incompetently conducted that they actually succeeded in creating a substantial insurgency and losing control. The British have effectively pulled out of the southern provinces where they were in charge because they simply couldn't control them. They're now in the hands of Shiite groups which are struggling for control. That's where most of the oil is. They happen to be pretty close to Iran, which is the last thing the U.S. wants. In fact, even the Prime Minister the U.S. chose, Maliki, has been traveling to Iran, expressing his gratitude for Iran's assistance and help. Sunni areas, if the Shiite areas are lost to U.S. control and move towards even closer relations with Iran, that itself is a disaster for the United States. Remember, that's where most of the oil is, and Iran is, of course, the country that the U.S. wants to, where it wants to overthrow the regime and restore some relation of the kind that existed under the Shah, who was imposed by a U.S.-British military coup destroying Iranian democracy. That's been going on since 1979. It's heating up now. And linkage to a Shiite-controlled region in Iran, in Iraq, where most of the oil is, would be a geostrategic disaster for the U.S. Maybe the U.S. can impose some kind of order and control and establish some kind of client state. Nobody knows. I mean, if it does, it could be something like what the Russians have succeeded in doing in Chechnya, apparently. So the Russians fought a brutal, vicious, murderous war in Chechnya, practically destroyed the capital, Grozny. Tremendous resistance, but they do seem to have established control. Chechnya is the kind of positive reports you read here about Iraq, you can also read in the Russian press about Chechnya, probably with better reason. Don't consider that a great success any more than I praise the Germans for the Nazis for establishing a peace and order in Vichy France. But it's conceivable. It doesn't look terribly likely, but it's at least conceivable. However, by any measure, it's been a disastrous failure of aggression in which should have been a very easy military occupation. For Iraqis, of course, it's a total disaster. Death toll resulting from the invasion is probably about 1 million. That's in addition to probably comparable number of deaths caused by the sanctions. There are about 4 million people displaced, several million in surrounding countries, mostly Syria, also Jordan, who are going, who really deserve, they're not treating them terribly well, but they deserve a lot of praise in many ways, even for accepting them. The U.S. is refusing to accept refugees. I think there's a symbolic 7,500 or so, though the U.S. is, of course, responsible for them. And Syria and Iran and Jordan are getting almost, Syria certainly is getting no support for this, its efforts in absorbing in some manner the refugees. Jordan a little bit, but not much. But that's roughly a couple of million dead from the sanctions and the war, 4 million refugees, 2 million internally displaced. This is a country of about 25 million people. This is plus massive destruction of the countries. Fallujah was almost totally destroyed. It's a real horror. Beyond that, there's the sheer barbarism of the invasion. I mean, the invaders by Iraqis are commonly described as comparable to they're compared to the Mongol invasions in the 13th century. The National Archives were looted and precious historical materials destroyed. The Sumerian sites, most of them, maybe 80%, have been destroyed. There was a military camp placed near Babylon, and who knows what that destroyed. I mean, this is, for Iraqis, for Americans, maybe this doesn't matter, but Iraqis care about their culture, their civilization, their history, which is in fact the origins of Western civilization. And from their point of view, this is just more barbarians coming in, destroying everything around, with some justice. That these feelings are not going to go away quickly anywhere in parts of the world where they care about the history of Western civilization and cultural values. Unlike here. Here, the reaction is Rumsfeld, stuff happens.
You're listening to Flashpoints on Pacifica Radio. We're speaking with Professor Noam Chomsky. Professor Chomsky, let's sort of stay with Iran for a moment, moving from Iraq to Iran, references to Iran. Talk about how you see perhaps the multiple dangers, a lot of saber rattling, a lot of threats of war, and is there sort of a synergy between the extreme right in the U.S. and in Iran?
Well, they're certainly mutually supportive. I mean, the more threat, if you listen to Iranian dissidents, reformers, democracy activists, and so on, they're bitterly critical of both the Iranian theocratic rulers who are harsh and repressive, and they're just as critical of the United States because they understand perfectly well that the threats against Iran, threats of war, which happen to be in violation of the UN Charter, if anybody cares. But the threats of war, of course, support the harshest and most repressive elements in the government. When you threaten a country with attack, repression increases, and people, in fact, huddle under the umbrella of power. We know what happens when far more restricted limited threats exist in the United States. People accept serious repression. Of course, it's qualitatively different when a superpower threatens to destroy you. That's a different story, but it's the same dynamics. So yeah, by threatening Iran, and even by carrying out what's called democracy promotion programs, which Iranians understand is an attempt at subversion, of course. Even those just increase the repression and increase support for the regime, for the harshest elements in the regime. And the Iranian actions, and especially here in the United States and in the West generally, the Iranian who is most beloved is Ahmadinejad, because he's a loose cannon, and he's constantly coming out with outrageous statements of one sort or another. It's rarely pointed out that his power is quite limited, and in foreign affairs or nuclear issues, almost very, very limited indeed. The power lies in the hands of the supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, and the executive council Guardians Council that he's responsible to. And they're rarely reported. They're more moderate and therefore not helpful for building up the war fever. But it is an extremely ominous situation. I mean, opposition to any war is overwhelming. I mean, in the region where people don't like Iran, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, where polls have been taken, these are countries where Iran is very unpopular. And nevertheless, a large majority would favors Iran having nuclear weapons to any kind of military action in Iran. Obviously, in the rest of the world, there's just horror at the idea that there might be another active U.S. or Israeli aggression in Iran, which could have incalculable effects. One leading British military historian, Correlli Barnett, recently wrote that it would just mean World War III going on indefinitely. Nevertheless, it's possible that Cheney and a couple of others might carry it off as a desperate act of some kind. Everything they've touched has turned into a catastrophe, and they may try to resurrect something from the chaos. In fact, it could even be a winning platform in the 2008 election. If there's an imminent war or an actual strike, people here will tend to, and the Democrats are not going to say anything about it. A few little mumbling, but no basic criticism. In fact, practically, I think every viable Democratic candidate has said that all options are on the table, including a military strike. So there won't be much of a political opposition. And then, the claim that we're defending the country from terror, and basically a replay of the scenario before the invasion of Iraq. That could be a winning card. Terrible outcome for the United States and for the world, but it's conceivable. The more crucial question is whether there's a way of settling the problem. And in fact, there is. A very simple way, in fact. If Iran and the United States were functioning democracies, meaning countries in which the popular will has a significant influence on policy, if that were true, the issue would be resolved. There have been careful studies of public opinion in Iran and in the United States by the leading institutions, and they have interesting results. They show that Iranians and Americans pretty much agree by overwhelming majorities on how to resolve the crisis. By overwhelming majorities in the 75% range in both countries, they agree that Iran should have the right to nuclear power, as any signer of the Non-Proliferation Treaty does, but that it should not have nuclear weapons. I might add here that we constantly read that what's called the international community thinks that insists, in fact, that Iran must stop uranium enrichment. But that statement only is possible because of the racist assumptions that prevail in the West. The non-aligned countries, which are the large majority of the people of the world, they agree with the populations of Iran and the United States that Iran has the right to uranium enrichment for nuclear power, but not nuclear weapons. So that's one point. A second point is that in Iran and the United States, there is overwhelming agreement, again around 75%, that the whole region, Iran, meaning Iran, Israel, U.S. forces deployed in the region, and so on, that the whole region should be declared a nuclear weapons-free zone. Okay, that would resolve the crisis. In fact, the Iranian government's actually proposed that, but that's undiscussable in the United States. I can't recall seeing anyone, within the mainstream, even contemplating that. And that's not only a reasonable proposal, but it's one that the United States is obligated to pursue. You recall when the U.S. invaded Iraq, the U.S. and Britain appealed to a UN Security Council resolution 687 from 1991, which required Iraq to eliminate weapons of mass destruction. And the U.S. and Britain claimed falsely, as we know, that they had done it. But that resolution is what they appealed to. Well, that resolution also states that the U.S. and Britain are obligated to move towards establishing a nuclear weapons-free zone in the region. That article of the resolution is sort of kept undercover, but it's there. I think it's Article 14, if you want to look it up. Okay, that would be a very sensible proposal. It would mitigate the threat of catastrophic conflict quite significantly. But the U.S. and Britain and the West generally won't even hear of it. You have to look hard to find any support for it or even mention of it. These are ways of probably eliminating the crisis. A large majority of Americans, again, I think it's around 75% last time I looked, are opposed to threats against Iran and in favor of moving towards establishing normal diplomatic relations with them, trade relations, and so on. Well, that again would be a way of mitigating the crisis, and also a way of helping the reformist elements inside Iran, which do exist and are significant, but very harshly repressed. We can't help them by moving towards normal relations with the country instead of insisting on forceful regime change, which simply undermines them. I might add on the side that popular opinion, in fact for decades, has been about the same with regard to Cuba. A large majority are opposed to the continuing threats, terror, economic strangulation, and want to move towards normal relations with Cuba. But again, that's not even not discussable. It's not part of anyone's political agenda except at the margins.
Running out of time here, speaking with Professor Noam Chomsky, there's two more questions. Maybe we can get briefer answers to these questions. First of all, the 800-pound gorilla in that peace proposal about a nuclear-free zone includes having to face the fact that Israel is a nuclear renegade, and that's what people don't want to talk about, among other things. But today the White House announced in this context invitations were sent out, so-called peace conferences toward a Palestinian state. Professor Chomsky, do you still feel hopeful? Do you feel hopeful about these talks? Do you think a two-state solution is still possible?
A two-state solution is very possible. In fact, that the U.S. and Israel have blocked it for 30 years. In fact, they're the only relevant force opposed to it. Right now, a two-state solution has been supported for years by the Arab states, by the Palestinian Authority. Ayatollah Khamenei, as I mentioned, who's in charge of foreign policy for Iran, has said that Iran supports the Arab League position, not only for two states, but for normalization of relations with Israel. Hamas supports it. They've repeatedly made it clear that they would support a two-state solution. That's even reported repeatedly in the U.S. press. The rest of the world, goes without saying, supports it. The one barrier is that the U.S. and Israel reject it. They claim to be in favor of it, but if you look at what they're in favor of, it's some kind of truncated, unviable collection of cantons, which make the Bantustans look good. What about the American population? Well, the American population joins the international consensus. It also supports a two-state settlement on the international border with some minor modifications and territorial exchanges. Pretty much the international consensus for years. When I say the U.S. and Israel have opposed it for 30 years, that requires a qualification. There is 1 week in Taba, Egypt, in January 2001, when Israeli and Palestinian negotiators, high-level negotiators, came very close to a settlement. And the U.S. would have supported that. That was Clinton's last month. So that's the 1 week of exceptions. And they said in their last press conference that if they had a few days more, they might have reached a solution. Well, unfortunately, Prime Minister Barak of Israel terminated the negotiations abruptly before a settlement could be reached. But picking up from that starting point, taking that as a starting point, it should be possible to move towards a two-state settlement, which is the only viable short-term arrangement that can be imagined.
Even in spite of the expanded seizures, the intensified attacks, the deepening crackdown, the incredible tragedy of undermining democracy, you think there's still possible? It's still possible? Is there enough land to have a Palestinian state?
The land would be 22% of the former Palestine. That's the West Bank and Gaza, with perhaps some minor and mutual adjustments, some straightening out of line, some land exchanges here and there. Yeah, it's viable. And the only major barrier is the U.S. government, not the U.S. population, the U.S. government and the Israeli government. Now, if the U.S. government decides to join the international consensus to abandon its 30 years of rejectionism, Israel will go along. There's almost no question of that. They have no choice. So we're back to where we were before. If the United States were a functioning democracy in which popular opinion influences policy, this could probably be settled too. It's not a lovely settlement by any means, but it's a lot better than what's going on now. What's going on now is utterly horrendous. I mean, it's not discussed in these terms in the United States, but the facts are uncontroversial. I mean, the Palestinians had a free election. It was closely monitored, accepted as free and fair. Well, from the U.S. point of view, the wrong people won. So the United States and Israel, with the backing of Europe, immediately turned to harsh punishment of the population. You got to be punished if you vote the wrong way in a free election. That's what's called democracy promotion. Democracy promotion means vote the way we tell you to. If not, you're going to be punished. There was serious escalation of Israeli violence in the Gaza Strip. It was cut off from access to the outside world. They want to really make the people suffer badly. And it's pretty open. Nobody conceals it. The U.S. and Israel also moved at once to try to provide the military arms and training to the group that they supported, that they wanted to win, Fatah group. Well, there was a preemptive coup in Gaza in which Hamas undermined that goal by taking full power, and that caused further strangulation of the population and the crushing of any hope for a viable existence. Well, again, if the United States government can be compelled to overcome its hatred and contempt for democracy, of which this is a very dramatic example, then, yeah, there could be a move there towards reducing the internal violence, corruption, hatred, destruction. Yeah, it could be done. I don't think it's impossible. The major barriers are right here.
All right, Professor Noam Chomsky, we appreciate the time you've given us here on the Flashpoint show. Obviously, a lot of people are going to learn a lot from the interview, as I have. Thanks for being with us.
Glad to be with you.